Account of the Kingdom of Cabul and its dependencies in Persia and India 1808 to 1809. Audiobook version produced by Gamal Audio. At the beginning of the 19th century, the land stretching between India, Afghanistan and Persia stood at the crossroads of empires. This was a time when European powers were expanding their political and intellectual horizons, seeking to understand the peoples and territories that lay beyond the familiar boundaries of Europe. One of the most remarkable attempts to understand this region was undertaken by the Scottish diplomat and scholar Mountstuart Elphinstone. In 1808, the British East India Company dispatched Elphinstone on a diplomatic mission to the court of the Afghan ruler Shah Shuja Durrani. The purpose of the mission was political. Britain feared that the ambitions of Napoleon Bonaparte in alliance with Persia might threaten British India. Afghanistan therefore became a crucial strategic frontier. The company hoped to secure the friendship of the Afghan ruler and prevent any European rival from advancing toward India through Central Asia. Yet the mission achieved something far greater than its immediate diplomatic goal. During his journey across the frontier regions of India into Afghanistan, Elphinstone carefully observed the land, the tribes, the customs, and the political institutions of the country. His curiosity was not limited to diplomacy. He approached the region with the spirit of an Enlightenment scholar. He spoke with local chiefs, questioned merchants and travellers, and collected information about geography, languages, traditions, and systems of governance. The result was a monumental work, Account of the Kingdom of Cabul and its dependencies in Persia and India. Published in 1815, this book became one of the earliest and most detailed European studies of Afghanistan and the surrounding regions. For many readers in Europe, it offered the first comprehensive description of the Afghan people, known to the British as the Afghans or Pathans, their tribal organisation, their fierce independence, and the rugged landscape they inhabited. Elphinstone's account was not merely a travel narrative. It was a work of historical observation, political analysis, and ethnographic description. It attempted to explain how Afghan society functioned, how tribes governed themselves, how power shifted among chiefs, and how the Kingdom of Kabul stood at the intersection of Persian, Central Asian, and Indian worlds. Today, more than 2 centuries later, this book remains an invaluable historical record. It allows us to glimpse the societies of the region as they existed in the early 19th century, before the transformations brought by modern empires, colonial frontiers, and nation-states. For listeners interested in the history of Afghanistan, the frontier regions of present-day Pakistan, and the complex interaction between European observers and Asian societies, Elphinstone's work is a foundational text. What you are about to hear is drawn from that remarkable account, a window into a world observed in 1808 and 1809, when a young Scottish envoy travelled across the frontier and recorded, with careful attention, the people and lands that lay between India and Central Asia. Now, next audiobook, Narrative of the Proceedings of the Mission, by Mountstuart Elphinstone. In the year 1808, when, from the embassy of General Gardan to Persia and other circumstances, it appeared as if the French intended to carry the war into Asia, it was thought expedient by the British government in India to send a mission to the King of Caubul, and I was ordered on that duty. As the court of Cabul was known to be haughty and supposed to entertain a mean opinion of the European nations, it was determined that the mission should be in a style of great magnificence, and suitable preparations were made at Delhi for its equipment. An excellent selection was made of officers to accompany it, and the following was the establishment of the embassy. Secretary, Mr. Richard Stracey. Assistants, Mr. Fraser and Mr. R. Alexander of the Honourable East India Company's Civil Service. Surgeon Mr. McWhirter, Bengal Establishment. Captain Pittman, 2nd Battalion, 6th Regiment, Bengal Native Infantry. Surveyors: Lieutenant McCartney, 5th Regiment, Bengal Native Cavalry, commanding the cavalry of the escort, and Lieutenant Tickle, Bengal Engineers. Officers attached to the escort: Captain Raper, 1st Battalion, 10th Regiment. Lieutenant Harris, Artillery. Lieutenant Cunningham, 2nd Battalion, 27th Regiment. Lieutenant Ross, 2nd Battalion, 6th Regiment. Lieutenant Irvine, 1st Battalion, 11th Regiment. Lieutenant Fitzgerald, 6th Regiment Native Cavalry. Lieutenant Jacob, 2nd Battalion, 23rd Regiment. The escort was composed of a troop from the 5th Regiment of Native Cavalry and a detail from the 6th, making 100 men, 200 infantry and 100 irregular cavalry. All things being prepared, the embassy left Delhi on the 13th of October 1808. From that city to Kanund, a distance of about 100 miles, is through the British dominions and need not be described. It is sufficient to say that the country is sandy, though not ill-cultivated. On approaching Kanund, we had the first specimen of the desert, to which we were looking forward with anxious curiosity. 3 miles before reaching that place, we came to sandhills, which at first were covered with bushes, but afterwards were naked piles of loose sand, rising one after another like the waves of the sea, and marked on the surface by the wind like drifted snow. There were roads through them, made solid by the treading of animals, but off the road our horses sunk into the sand above the knee. We set off from Kanund on the 21st of October, and in the course of the march we quitted the dependencies of our own government and entered the district of Shekhawutti, so called from a predatory tribe of Rajputs who inhabit it, the country becoming more and more desert as we advanced. On the 2nd we reached Singauna, a handsome town built of stone on the skirts of a hill of purplish rock about 600 feet high. I was here met by Raja Ubni Singh, the principal chief of the Shekhawut tribe. He was a little man with large eyes, inflamed by the use of opium. He wore his beard turned up on each side towards his ears, which gave him a mild and fierce appearance. His dress was plain, and his speech and manners, like those of all his countrymen, rude and unpolished. He was, however, very civil, and made many professions of respect and attachment to the British. I saw him several times, and he was always drunk either with opium or brandy. This was indeed the case with all the Shekhawutti Sirdars, who are seldom in a condition to appear till the effect of their last debauch is removed by a new dose. Consequently, it is only in the interval between sobriety and absolute stupefaction that they are fit for business. 2 marches from Singauna brought us to Georgiuna, a handsome town with some trees and gardens which look well in such a desert. Each of the chiefs, who are 5 in number, has a castle here, and here they assemble when the public affairs require a council. At this place I saw the remaining 4 Shekhawut chiefs. They were plain men. One of them, Shalm Singh, was remarkably mild and well behaved. Some of the others bore strong marks of the effects of opium in their eyes and countenance. They were all cousins, and seemed to live in great harmony. But scarcely had I crossed the desert when I heard that Shalm Singh had murdered the 3 others at a feast, stabbing the first of them with his own hand. After another march and a half over sand, from Junjuna towards Churu, we quitted the Shekhawutti. This country extends about 80 miles from north to south, and less from east to west. It has the extensive dominions of the Raja of Jaipur on the south, on the east the dependencies of the British government, and on the west the territories of Bikaner. On the northwest it has the barren country of the Batais, a plundering tribe, remarkable for carrying on their depredations on foot, and still more so for the length and rapidity of the incursions thus made. On the north is Haryana, the scene of the exploits of George Thomas, which, though on the borders of the desert, is celebrated for the verdure from which it derives its name, for the herds of cattle that are pastured on it, for the lions that it produces, and for the valour and independence of its inhabitants. It now belongs to the British. The Shekhawuti itself is a sandy plain, scattered with rocky hills, ill-watered and badly cultivated. Yet it contains several large towns, of which the chief are Sika, Futtehpur, Khetri and Gudha. The sands are sprinkled with tufts of long grass and bushes of bulbul, kuril and phoca, which last is peculiar to the desert and its borders. The Shekhawutis owe tribute and military service to the Raja of Jaipur. It was by the assistance of that government that they were enabled, at no very remote period, to wrest their present territory from the Kyamkaunis, a tribe of converted Hindus. A few miles beyond the Shekhawuti border, we entered the territories of the Raja of Bikaner. This Raja is perhaps the least important of 5 princes of Rajputana. Those of Jaipur and Jodhpur are at the head of considerable states. The reduced power of the Raja of Audiobook is kept from insignificance by his high rank and the respect which is paid him. But the territories of the Rajas of Jaisalmer and Bikaner are merely the most habitable parts of the desert, and, consequently, have little to boast in population or resources. The Raja of Bikaner's revenue only amounts to 50,000 el, but, as his troops are paid by assignments of land, he was able to keep up 2,000 horse, 8,000 foot, and 35 pieces of field artillery, even after the defeat he had suffered previous to my arrival at his capital. The style of his court also was very far from indicating the poverty of his government. His frontier place towards the Shekhawuti, and consequently the first part of his territories which we approached, was Churu, which may be reckoned the second town in his dominions. It is near 1.5 miles round, without counting its large but mean suburbs, and, though situated among naked sandhills, it has a very handsome appearance. The houses are all terraced, and both they and the walls of the town are built of a kind of limestone, of so pure white that it gives an air of great neatness to everything composed of it. It is, however, soft, and crumbles into a white powder mixed here and there with shells. It is found in large beds in many parts of the desert. The chief of Churu is a dependent rather than a subject of the Raja of Bikaner. The Shekhawuti country seems to lose its title to be included in the desert when compared with the 280 miles between its western frontier and Bahawalpur, and, even of this, only the last 100 miles are absolutely destitute of inhabitants, water or vegetation. Our journey from the Shekhawut frontier to Pugul, a distance of 180 miles, was over hills and valleys of loose and heavy sand. The hills were exactly like those which are sometimes formed by the wind on the seashore, but far exceeding them in their height, which was from 20 to 100 feet. They are said to shift their positions and to alter their shapes according as they are affected by the wind, and in summer, the passage of many parts of the desert is said to be rendered dangerous by the clouds of moving sand. But when I saw the hills, in winter, they seemed to have a great degree of permanence, for they bore a sort of grass, besides folk, and the thorny bushes of the bulbul, and the bear, or jujuba, which altogether gave them an appearance that sometimes amounted to verdure. Among the most dismal hills of sand, one occasionally meets with a village, if such a name can be given to a few round huts of straw, with low walls and conical roofs, like little stacks of corn. These are surrounded by hedges of thorny branches stuck in the sand, which, as well as the houses, are so dry that if they happen to catch fire, the village would be reduced to ashes in 5 minutes. These miserable abodes are surrounded by a few fields which depend for water on the rains and dews, and which bear thin crops of the poorest kind of pulse, and of bajra or holcus spicatus, and this last, though it flourishes in the most sterile countries, grows here with difficulty, each stalk several feet from its neighbour. The wells are often 300 feet deep, and one was 345 feet. With this enormous depth, some were only 3 feet in diameter. The water is always brackish, unwholesome, and so scanty that 2 bullocks working for a night easily emptied a well. The water is poured into reservoirs lined with clay, which our party drank dry in an instant after its arrival. These wells are all lined with masonry. The natives have a way of covering them with boards heaped with sand that effectually conceals them from an enemy. In the midst of so arid a country, the watermelon, the most juicy of fruits, is found in profusion. It is really a subject of wonder to see melons 3 or 4 feet in circumference, growing from a stalk as slender as that of the common melon in the dry sand of the desert. They are sown and perhaps require some cultivation, but they are scattered about to all appearance as if they grew wild. The common inhabitants are Yauts. The upper classes are Rathore Rajputs. The former are little, black and ill-looking, and bear strong appearances of poverty and wretchedness. The latter are stout and handsome, with hooked noses and Jewish features. They are haughty in their manners, very indolent, and almost continually drunk with opium. The stock consists of bullocks and camels, which are kept in numerous herds, and are used to carry loads, to ride on, and even to plough. Of the wild animals, the desert rat deserves to be mentioned for its numbers, though not for its size. The innumerable holes made by these animals where the ground is solid enough to admit of it are indeed a serious inconvenience to a horseman, whom they distress even more than the heavy sand. It is more like a squirrel than a rat, has a tuft at the end of its tail, and is often seen sitting upright with its 4 feet crossed like a kangaroo. It is not unlike the jerboa, but is much less, and uses all its feet. It is not peculiar to the desert, being found in most sandy places west of the Jumna. Antelopes are found in some parts, as is the gorka or wild ass, so well depicted in the book of Job. This animal is sometimes found alone, but oftener in herds. It resembles a mule rather than an ass, but is of the colour of the latter. It is remarkable for its shyness, and still more for its speed. At a kind of shuffling trot peculiar to itself, it will leave the fleetest horses behind. The foxes may also be mentioned. They are less than our fox, but somewhat larger than the common one of India. Their backs are of the same brownish colour with the latter, but in one part of the desert, their legs and belly, up to a certain height, are black, and in another white. The line between those colours and the brown is so distinctly marked that the one kind seems as if it had been wading up to the belly in ink, and the other in whitewash. The rest of the desert, for about 100 miles from Pugol to Bahawalpur, was a flat of hard clay, which sounded under our horses' feet like a board. In some places, small hills were formed by sand, apparently blown over the clay. On these were some bushes of folk, and some little plants of wild rue, and of a kind called lana, which bears a strong resemblance to everlasting, and which is said to yield abundance of alkali when burned. The clay was destitute of all vegetation, and in this tract, excepting the fort and pool of Mujga and 2 wells about 16 miles from Bahawalpur, there is neither water nor inhabitants to be found. Yet, as we travelled from the first on the road adopted by all caravans, it may be presumed that we saw the most habitable portion of the whole. It is obvious that a desert, such as I have described, could not be passed without preparation. Camels had accordingly been hired at Kanund to carry water and provisions, which completed the number of our camels to 600, besides 12 or 13 elephants. Our water was carried in leathern bags, made of the skins of sheep, besides some of the larger ones, made of the hides of oxen, and 24 large copper vessels, 2 of which were a load for a camel. These were made for the Hindu sepoys and proved the best contrivance, as the skins gave a great deal of trouble, and spilled much of the water after all. In providing water for the animals, we took no account of the camels, that creature bearing thirst for a period which is almost incredible. The women who had accompanied the mission were sent back from Churu with a guard, and many of our servants were allowed to return by the same opportunity. But this did not secure us the services of the remainder, for such was their dread of the desert, that men of all descriptions deserted by 20s and 30s, till we were so far advanced as to render their return impossible. As there was a war in Bikaner, and, as the road was at all times exposed to the depredations of the Bhuttis and other plunderers, we engaged 100 horse and 50 foot in the Shekhawutti to assist our regular escort in protecting our long line of baggage. All these arrangements being completed, we marched from Churu on the 30th of October. We marched in the night, as we had done since we entered the Shekhawutti. We generally began to load by 2 or 3 in the afternoon, but it was long before we were able to proceed, and the head of our line never reached the encamping ground till 12 or 1. On many occasions, we were much later, and once or twice it was broad day before we arrived at our stage. The marches were seldom very long. The longest was 26 miles, and the shortest 15. But the fatigue which our people suffered bore no proportion to the distance. Our line, when in the closest order, was 2 miles long. The path by which we travelled wound much to avoid the sandhills. It was too narrow to allow of 2 camels going abreast, and, if an animal stepped to one side, it sunk in the sand, as in snow, so that the least obstruction towards the head of the line stopped the whole, nor could the head move on if the rear was detained, lest that division, being separated from the guides, might lose its way among the sandhills. To prevent this, a signal was passed along the line by beat of drum when any circumstance occasioned a stoppage in the rear, and a trumpet, sounded from time to time at the head of the line, kept all informed of the direction in which the column was proceeding. The heavy sand made marching so fatiguing that we were obliged to allow camels for half the infantry sepoys, that they might ride by turns, 2 on a camel. We had, besides kajawas, or large panniers on camels, for the sick. The annoyance of the march was greatly increased by the incredible number of a sort of small burrs, which stuck to everything that touched them, and occasioned great uneasiness. They are, however, useful, inasmuch as they form a favourite food for horses, and the seed is eaten even by men. The want of water, and the quality of that which we met with, was also a great hardship to our men and followers, and, though the abundance of watermelons afforded occasional relief to their thirst, its effect on their health was by no means salutary. Such were the combined effects of fatigue, bad water, and the excessive use of watermelons, that a great proportion of the natives who accompanied us became afflicted with a low fever, accompanied by a dysentery, and to such a degree did this extend that 30 sepoys, without reckoning followers, were taken ill in the course of one day in Nicosia, and 40 persons of all descriptions expired during the first week of our halt at Bikaner. The great difference between the temperature of the days and nights no doubt contributed to this mortality. Even the English gentlemen used to suffer from cold during the night marches, and were happy to kindle a large fire as soon as we reached our ground. Yet the sun became powerful so early in the morning that we always woke with a feverish heat which lasted till sunset. The Europeans, however, did not suffer any serious illness. Some instances of violent inflammation in the eyelids were the only disorder of which we had to complain. Our march to Bikaner was attended with few adventures. Parties of plunderers were twice seen, but did not attack our baggage. Some of the people also lost their way and were missing for a day or 2, during which time they were in danger of being lost in the uninhabited parts of the desert, and were fired on by all the villages which they approached in hopes of getting guides or directions for their journey. At last, on the 5th of November, in the midst of a tract of more than ordinary desolation, we discovered the walls and towers of Bikaner, which presented the appearance of a great and magnificent city in the midst of a wilderness. Even after we reached our ground, there were disputes in camp whether it or Delhi was most extensive, but a little farther acquaintance removed this impression. The town was surrounded by a fine wall, strengthened with many round towers, and crowned with the usual Indian battlements. It contained some high houses and some temples, one of which had a lofty spire, and at one corner was a very high and showy fort. It was distinguished by the whiteness of all the buildings, arising from the material already described at Churu, and by the absence of trees, which give most Indian towns the appearance of woods rather than of inhabited places. The beauty of Bikaner, however, was all external. On entering the gates, most of it was found to be composed of huts with mud walls painted red. It was exceedingly populous, perhaps from the number of people who had fled to the capital in consequence of the state of the country. Bikaner was at this time invaded by 5 different armies, one of which, belonging to the Raja of Jodhpur and 15,000 strong, had arrived within a few miles of the city. Another smaller force was equally near, while the rest were endeavouring to reach the same point by different routes. A number of predatory horse had also been let loose to cut off the supplies of provisions from the surrounding countries, on which a city situated like Bikaner must obviously depend for existence. The Raja, on the other hand, filled up all the wells within 10 miles of his capital and trusted for deliverance to the desolation which surrounded him. This state of affairs was not very favourable for supplying the wants of the mission, and we thought ourselves lucky in being enabled to renew our march within 11 days. During this time, military operations were carried on between the parties. The smallest of the armed bodies near Bikaner was obliged to fall back a march. A convoy from the eastward also forced its way into the town, and another going to the enemy was cut off by the Raja's troops. Many men were killed on this occasion, and much plunder was taken by the victors. Their appearance, as they passed near our camp, was well described by one of the gentlemen of the mission. In one place was seen a party driving in oxen, in another some loaded carts, here a horseman pricking on a captured camel with his long spear, and there a gun dragged slowly through the sand by 15 or 20 bullocks. Disorderly bands of ragged soldiers were seen in all directions, most of them with plunder of some kind, and all in spirits with their victory. In the meantime, I was assailed by both parties with constant applications, the Jodhpur general urging me to come to his camp, and the Raja desiring me to take part with him. The former could only throw out hints of danger from omitting to comply with his wishes, but the Raja could at pleasure accelerate or retard the provision of our cattle and supplies, and by placing a guard over the well which had been allotted to us, he had one day showed to us, to our no small uneasiness, how completely he had us in his power. The restriction, however, was removed on a remonstrance, and might have been occasioned by the water being required elsewhere. For while we were taking in water for our journey, we were ourselves obliged to place guards over the well and to withhold water entirely from our camels for the 2 or 3 last days of our stay. The time of our residence was variously occupied. At first, there was some novelty in observing the natives, with whom our camp was crowded like a fair. Nothing could exceed their curiosity, and when one of us appeared abroad, he was stared at like a prodigy. They wore loose clothes of white cotton or muslin, like the people of Hindustan, but were distinguished from them by their Rajput features and by their remarkable turban, which rises high over the head like a mitre and has a cloth of some other colour wound around the bottom. Some of our party went into the town, where, although curiosity drove a mob round them, they were treated with great civility. Others rode out into the desert, but were soon wearied with the dreary and unvaried prospect it afforded. For within 10 yards of the town was as much barren as the wildest part of Arabia. On the northern side alone, there was something like a woody valley. The most curious sight at Bikaner was a well of fine water, immediately under the fort, which is the residence of the Raja. It was 300 feet deep and 15 or 20 feet in diameter. 4 buckets, each drawn by a pair of oxen, worked at it at once, and when a bucket was let down, it striking the water made a noise like a great gun. Great part of our time was taken up with the Raja's visit and our attendance at his palace. The Raja came to my camp through a street, formed by his own troops and joined by one of ours, which extended from the skirts of the camp to the tent where he was received. He was carried on men's shoulders in a vehicle, like the body of an old-fashioned coach. He was preceded by a great many chobdars, bearing slender silver maces with large knobs at the top, which they waved over their heads in the air and followed by a numerous retinue. He sat down on a musnud, a kind of throne composed of cushions, under a canopy, or rather an awning of red velvet, embroidered and laced with gold, and supported by 4 silver pillars, all of which he had sent out for the purpose. We conversed on various subjects for an hour. Among other topics, the Raja inquired about the age of the king, the climate of England, and the politics of the nation. He showed a knowledge of our relation to France, and one of the company asked whether my mission was not owing to our wars with that nation. Presents were at last put before him and his courtiers, according to the Indian custom, after which he withdrew. Raja Surat Singh is a man of a good height and a fair complexion for an Indian. He has black whiskers and a beard, except on the middle of his chin, a long nose and Rajput features. He has a good face and a smiling countenance. He is reckoned an oppressive prince. It is strongly suspected that he poisoned his elder brother, whom he succeeded, and it is certain that he murdered an agent sent from the Vizier of Hindustan to the King of Caubul. Yet, as he is very strict in his devotions, and particular in the diet prescribed by his religion, his subjects allow him the character of a saint. I returned his visit on the next day, but one, having been invited by his second son, who, though an infant, was sent for that purpose with a great retinue. The fort looked well as we approached. It was a confused assemblage of towers and battlements, overtopped by houses crowded together. It is about 1/4 mile square, surrounded by a wall 30 feet high and a good dry ditch. The palace was a curious old building, in which, after ascending several flights of steps, we came to a court surrounded by buildings, and then had 100 yards to go before we reached a small stone hall, supported by pillars, where the Raja took his seat under his canopy. The court was different from anything I had seen, those present being fairer than other Hindustanis, and marked by their Jewish features and showy turbans. The Raja and his relations had turbans of many colours, richly adorned with jewels, and the Raja sat resting his arms on a shield of steel, the bosses and rim of which were set with diamonds and rubies. After some time, the Raja proposed that we should withdraw from the heat and crowd, and conducted us into a very neat, cool and private apartment in a separate court. The walls were of plaster, as fine as stucco, and were ornamented in good taste. The doors were closed with curtains of China satin. Then we were seated on the ground. In the Indian way, the Raja began a speech in which he said he was a subject of the throne of Delhi, that Delhi was now in our hands, and he seized the opportunity of my coming to acknowledge our sovereignty. He then called for the keys of his fort and insisted on my taking them, which I refused, disclaiming the extended rights ascribed to us. After a long contest, the Raja consented to keep the keys, and when some more conversations had passed, a mob of dancing women entered and danced and sang till we withdrew. We at last marched from Bikaner on the night of the 16th of November. The country we passed on the 2 first nights was like that already described, and our people were so fatigued after the second march that we intended to have halted a day to refresh them, when the Dewan of the Raja of Bikaner acquainted us with some movements of a certain partisan, and of some of the predatory tribes of the desert, which induced us to move in the day instead of the night, to enable us the better to protect our baggage. In consequence of this change, the general beat at 2 o'clock in the morning, November 19th, but it was daylight before our water, and all our other loads were prepared, and it was dark before we reached our ground at Pugul, after a march of 24 miles. The whole was wavy sandhills, some of them of an astonishing height. Our people were in great distress for water during the whole day. At Pugul, however, we found abundance of good water for sale. It was rainwater, preserved in small reservoirs, vaulted over with brick and mortar. There was well water also, which was brackish, but not noxious. The wells were not more than half as deep as those of Bikaner. We halted on the 20th of November to take in water, and I had a good opportunity of examining the place. If I could present to my reader the foreground of high sandhills, the village of straw huts, the clay walls of the little fort going to ruins as the ground which supported them was blown away by the wind, and the sea of sand without a sign of vegetation, which formed the rest of the prospect, he probably would feel, as I did, a sort of wonder at the people who could reside in so dismal a wilderness, and of horror at the life to which they seemed to be condemned. On the 21st, we marched at daybreak, and for the first 10 or 12 miles were in sand, as above described, after which we reached the hard plain. No sooner were we more clear of the sandhills than our camels moved up into a line of 12 or 15 abreast, and the whole of our caravan began to move with tolerable speed. The contrast between this and the sandhills was very exhilarating, though even those had not been unpleasing, while they had novelty to recommend them. In the course of the day, we were overtaken by a subject of Buhawul Khan, who had lost his way in tracking some camels carried off in an incursion of the Rajputs, had exhausted his skin of water, and had tasted no food for 2 days. We fed and put him on a camel. Before dark, we met a party of 150 soldiers on camels, belonging to Bahawul Khan, the chief of one of the King of Caubul's eastern provinces. There were 2 men on each camel, and each had a long and glittering matchlock. They advanced and saluted in 3 or 4 very good lines. Their camels seemed as manageable as horses, and their appearance was altogether novel and striking. Their commander had a long beard and was dressed in a Persian tunic of buff broadcloth with gold buttons and a low cap like the crown of a hat. He was mounted on an excellent, light, speedy and easy camel with a very showy saddle and 2 reins, one passing through a hole in each nostril of the camel. His language was scarcely intelligible to any of our party. He brought us 100 camels, carrying 400 skins of water from Mujga. He had also 4 brazen jars of water from the hyphasis, which was intended for our drinking and was sealed up with the Khan's signet. We soon after encamped in the midst of the desert, about 26 miles from Pugul. We enjoyed the water of the hyphasis extremely, and were all delighted with the new people we were getting among, and the new scenes we were approaching. On the 22nd, we made a march of 30 miles to Mujga. The heat of the afternoon was intense while we halted as usual in the naked plain, to give our people some water, and to take some refreshment ourselves. In the course of the day, several hundred skins of water came to us from Mulgur, where Bahawal Khan had sent his principal officers to receive us. Towards evening, many persons were astonished with the appearance of a long lake, enclosing several little islands. Notwithstanding the well-known nature of the country, many were positive that it was a lake, and one of the surveyors took the bearings of it. It was, however, only one of those illusions which the French call mirage and the Persians sirob. I had imagined this phenomenon to be occasioned by a thin vapour, or something resembling a vapour, such as is seen over the ground in the hot weather in India. But this appearance was entirely different, and, on looking along the ground, no vapour whatever could be perceived. The ground was quite level and smooth, composed of dried mud or clay, mixed with particles of sparkling sand. There were some tufts of grass and some little bushes of rue at this spot, which were reflected as in water, and this appearance continued at the ends when viewed from the middle. I shall not attempt to account for this appearance, but shall merely remark that it seems only to be found in level, smooth and dry places. The position of the sun, with reference to the spectator, appears to be immaterial. I thought at first that great heat always accompanied its appearance, but it was afterwards seen in Daman, where the weather was not hotter than is experienced in England. About sunset, we descried the high walls and towers of Mujga, with a conspicuous mosque which stands over the gateway, and a tomb with a cupola, ornamented with painted tiles, resembling, as I was told, the tombs of Imamzadas in Persia. We arrived a little after dark, and encamped near the fort, which is small and weak. We remained here 2 days, taking in water. Bahawul Khan's Divan and another of his officers who joined us here were Hindus. The third was a Mulal of Multan, whose dress, language and manners were very like those of Persia. Even the Hindus sometimes used the Persian idiom in speaking Hindustani, and the Diwan looked and spoke more like a Persian mullah than a Hindu. On the 25th of November, we marched 27 miles to 2 wells in the desert. In the way we saw a most magnificent mirage, which looked like an extensive lake or a very wide river. The water seemed clear and beautiful, and the figures of 2 gentlemen who rode along it were reflected as distinctly as in real water. A small but neat tower was seen in this march, and we were told it was a place of refuge for travellers against the predatory hordes who infest the route of caravans. There were some stunted bushes of the Mimosa arabica on the ground, and at the ground was something that might be called a tree. On the 26th, we marched at daylight and passed over low and bare hills of loose sand and bottoms of hard clay, till, after travelling 12 miles, we perceived something stretched across in front of us, which soon after appeared to be trees. We then pushed on with increased alacrity, and soon reached a place where the desert and the cultivated country were separated as if by a line. A long row of trees ran along the edge of the sands, and beyond it were clumps of trees, green fields, and wells of abundant and clear water, with houses and every sign of fertility and cultivation. One of the first things we saw was a well, worked by a Persian wheel, which was pouring out water in the greatest abundance. The trees, though only low tamarisk, seemed enchanting to us, and everything was welcome after our 5 weeks' sojourn in the desert. We passed for 1.5 miles under the walls of Bahawalpur, which, as well as the roads, were crowded with spectators, who, in their turn, afforded no uninteresting spectacle to us. A striking difference was observable between them and the people on the east of the desert. Those we now saw were strong, dark, harsh-featured, had their hair and beards long, wore caps oftener than turbans, and spoke a language entirely unintelligible to our Hindustani attendants. The better sort wore the dress and affected the manners of Persia. After crossing a small canal and passing through some fields, we left the woods and at length reached the banks of the Hyphasis. I was much disappointed in the breadth of the river, as well as with the appearance of its shores, but it was impossible to look without interest on a stream which had borne the fleet of Alexander. On the next day, but one Bahawul Khan arrived, having come 40 miles on purpose to show attention to the mission. Indeed, his whole conduct, from the time we approached his frontier, showed a spirit of kindness and hospitality which could not be surpassed. Nor did it cease when we left this country, for, even after we had passed the Indus, he continued to send us intelligence and to take every opportunity of showing us attention. In our first intercourse with him, we began to determine the presents to be made, expecting to have a long struggle against his rapacity, as is usual on such occasions in most parts of India. But we soon found we had to encounter a difficulty of another kind. Bahawul Khan would take nothing without a negotiation, while he was anxious to show his own liberality to an extent which we were unwilling to admit. On the day of his arrival, he sent 80 sheep, 100 maunds of flour, and other articles of the same kind. Next day, he sent 100 pots of sweetmeats, a vast number of baskets of oranges, 10 bags of almonds and raisins, and 5 bags, each containing 1,000 rupees, equal to £120, to be given to the servants. I was a little embarrassed by this last piece of hospitality, but was obliged to submit on condition that the Khan's servants should accept a similar donation from me. On the 29th, Mr. Strachey and Captain Raper paid a visit to the Khan, and returned charmed with the polite and cordial reception he gave them. Among other conversation, he praised the King of Caubul highly, but said he had never seen him. He feared the snows of Kabul, and was besides a dweller of the desert, and unworthy to appear before so great a monarch. On the 1st of December, he came to my tent. He was a plain, open, pleasant man, about 45 or 50 years of age. He had on a white tunic with small gold buttons, over which was a wide mantle of very rich and beautiful gold brocade. On his head was a cap of brocade, and over it a longi, or silken turban, twisted loosely. About 6 of his attendants sat, the rest stood round and were well dressed and respectable. Our conversation turned on India and England and lasted till the Khan remarked it was getting late. On the 2nd, I returned his visit. The streets were crowded to an incredible degree, and the terraced tops of the houses were covered with spectators. They left the part of the street through which we were to pass quite clear, and, except now and then, an exclamation of surprise when we came in sight, they kept a profound silence. The Khan received us in a handsome room with attic windows, round which a neat and orderly company were seated on a Persian carpet. He conversed freely on all subjects, said he had never seen the king, and please God he never would. He could live in his desert and hunt his deer, and had no desire to follow courts. He showed me a curious clock, made by one of his own people. The works seemed very good. The bell was below the works, and the whole was in a case of gold with very thick crystal sides. He also showed an excellent gun lock made at Bahawalpur. He gave me 2 fine hawks, some greyhounds, 2 horses, one with gold and the other with enamelled trappings, a very beautiful matchlock richly enamelled, with a powder flask in the English model, and some trays of cloths of the place. On the 4th we marched. Bahawal Khan sent out a tent into the neighbourhood of ours, where we had a parting meeting while our last baggage was crossing the river. He introduced the mechanic who made the clock, and presented me to some persons, who he said were ulama, or Mohammedan school divines. Afterwards, he retired to a carpet at some distance from the tents with Mr. Strachey and me, and there spoke fully on all subjects, giving me all the advice and information in his power. He ended by saying that as he was the first subject of Khorasan with whom we had met, he hoped we would preserve the remembrance of him after we had extended our acquaintance. We took leave of him with great regret. He had been liberal and kind to us during our stay, without over-civility or ceremony, and had an appearance of sincerity in everything he said, which made his show of friendship the more agreeable. We rode out often during our halt at Bahawalpur and saw the town and its environs. The town is about 4 miles in circumference, but there are gardens of mango trees within the walls. The houses are of unburnt bricks with terraces of mud. The city wall is of mud and very thin. Bahawalpur is remarkable for the manufacture of lungis, or silken girdles, and turbans. The inhabitants of this and all the neighbouring countries onto the west and north are principally Juts and Baloches, who profess the Mohammedan religion. There are more Hindus at Bahawalpur than any of the other provinces the mission passed through. Afghans are foreigners there. The country, for 4 or 5 miles on each side of the Hyphasis, is formed of the slime deposited by the river. It is very rich and often so soft that it cannot be ridden on. Some parts are highly cultivated, and others are covered with coppice of low tamarisk, in which are many wild boars and hog deer. Wild geese, partridges, florikins, and other game are also abundant on the banks of the river. The river winds much at this place and is very muddy, but the water, when cleared, is excellent. It is here called the Gara, and is formed by the joint streams of the Hyphasis, or Baya, and Isudrus, or Sutlej. The mission marched on the 5th of December from the right bank of the Hyphasis, and reached Multan on the 11th, a distance of near 70 miles. After the first 5 or 6 miles, the country was in general dry, sandy, and destitute of grass, but scattered with bushes. Immediately round the villages, which were pretty numerous, were fields of wheat, cotton, and turnips in a thriving condition. There were also a great number of large and deep watercourses throughout the whole journey that, judging from them alone, one would have supposed the country to be highly cultivated. Before we reached Multan, we were overtaken by 25 camels sent us by Bahawul Khan. That chief is famous for his camels, some of which he keeps for his own use and always hunts upon them. They are very generally used in all the desert country and are admirably calculated for long journeys. An elderly minister of the Raja of Bikaner, whom I met at Singana, had just come on a camel from Bikaner, a distance of 175 miles in 3 days. Several of our party liked them so well as to continue to ride them for pleasure after we had crossed the Indus. Their walk and trot are far from being very uneasy. The city of Multan stands about 4 miles from the left bank of the Chenab, or Assassins. It is above 4.5 miles in circumference. It is surrounded with a fine wall between 40 and 50 feet high, with towers at regular distances. It has also a citadel on a rising ground, and several fine tombs, particularly 2, with very high cupolas, ornamented with the painted and glazed tile already noticed, which altogether gave it a magnificent appearance. These tombs are seen from a great distance all round the town. Multan is famous for its silks and for a sort of carpet much inferior to those of Persia. The country immediately round the city was very pleasing, fertile, well cultivated, and well watered from wells. The people were like those at Bahawalpur, except that there were more men who looked like Persians mixed with them. These, however, were individuals, and chiefly horsemen. The mission remained for 19 days in the neighbourhood of Multan, and as most of the party were out almost every day from 7 or 8 to 3 or 4, shooting, hunting or hawking, we had good opportunities of observing the country. The land was flat and the soil excellent, but a large proportion of the villages were in ruins, and there were other signs of a well-cultivated country going to decay. About 1/2 was still cultivated, and most abundantly watered by Persian wheels. The produce was wheat, millet, cotton, turnips, carrots, and indigo. The trees were chiefly neem and date, with here and there a peepul tree. The uncultivated country near the river was covered with thick copsewood of tamarisk, mixed with a tree like a willow, about 20 feet high. At a distance from the river, it was bare, except for scattered tufts of long grass, and here and there a date tree. The country abounded in game of all kinds. The weather was delightful during our stay. The thermometer, when at the lowest, was at 28 degrees at sunrise. There were slight frosts in the night, but the days were rather warm. We were detained thus long at Multan by the necessity of purchasing and hiring camels, and of obtaining correct intelligence of the King of Caubul's motions, as well as of waiting for a Memandar from His Majesty to accompany the mission after it entered the lands of the Afghan tribes. We were also occupied in changing the camels which we brought from Hindustan for those of the country, in making warm clothing for the sepoys, and in procuring horses to mount many of our attendants, according to the custom of the country we were about to enter. The principal events of our stay were our meetings with the governor of the province. The name of this personage was Serafraz Khan, and as his government was in India, he had the title of Nabob. He was of an Afghan family, of the royal tribe of Sudozia, but his ancestors had so long been settled in Multan that he had lost most of the characteristics of his nation. He seems to have been seized with a panic as soon as he heard of the approach of the mission, and the whole of his behaviour to the end was marked with suspicion and distrust. He shut the gates of the city against us and allowed none of our men or followers to enter without express permission. He also doubled his guards, and we heard, from good authority, of debates in his council, whether it was most probable that we should endeavour to surprise the city, or that we should procure a cession of it to us from the king. He, however, agreed to visit me on the 15th of December, and a very large tent was pitched for his reception. One end of it was open, and from the entrance 2 canvas screens ran out, so as to form an alley about 20 yards long, which was lined with servants in livery, other servants extending beyond it. The troops were also drawn up in line along the road to the tent. Mr. Strachey went to meet the governor and found him mounted on a white horse with gold trappings, attended by his officers and favourites, surrounded with large standards and escorted by 200 horse and 3,000 foot. The dust, crowd and confusion of the meeting are represented by Mr. Strachey as beyond all description. The governor welcomed Mr. Strachey according to the Persian custom, after which they joined and proceeded to the tent, the pressure and disorder increasing as they went. In some places, men were fighting, and in others, people were ridden down. Mr. Strachey's own horse was nearly borne to the ground and only recovered himself by a violent exertion. When they approached the tent, they missed the road, came in front of the line of troops, and rushed on the cavalry with such impetuosity that there was barely time to wheel back so as to allow a passage. In this manner, the tide poured on towards the tent. The line of servants was swept away, the screens were torn down and trampled underfoot, and even the tent ropes were assailed with such fury that the whole tent was nearly struck over our heads. The inside was crowded and darkened in an instant. The governor and about 10 of his companions sat. The rest seemed to be armed attendants, and indeed, the governor seemed to have attended to nothing but the number of his guards. He sat but for a very short time, during the whole of which he was telling his beads with the utmost fervency and addressing me with, "You are welcome, you are very welcome," as fast as he could repeat the words. At last, he said he was afraid the crowd must annoy me, and withdrew. Surafrauz Khan was a good-looking young man. He wore the Persian dress with a cap and a shawl turban over it, and spoke very good Persian. His attendants were large, fair, and handsome Afghans, most of them very well dressed, but in no sort of order or discipline. On the same evening I returned his visit and found him sitting under an awning on a terrace in one of his gardens. He had a large company sitting with him in good order. They differed greatly in appearance from the natives of India, but were neither so handsomely dressed nor so decorous as Persians. The nabob, being now free from alarm, was civil and agreeable enough. While at Multan and in the neighbourhood, I received visits from Mullah Jafar Sistani, from the king's deputy, Hikara Borshi, or newswriter, and from various other persons. My intercourse with one person deserves to be mentioned as characteristic of the government of Multan. Secundar Khan, the nabob's uncle, being once hunting near my camp, sent to me to say that he had enclosed 3 wild boars within his nets, and to beg I would come and join in the chase of them. I thought it prudent to excuse myself, but I sent a native gentleman with a civil message and fine gunpowder and a spyglass. Secundar Khan returned me an indifferent horse, sent a boar to be hunted at leisure. Thus far all was well, but 2 days afterwards he sent back my present and desired to have his horse back, as he was in danger of being confined or put to death for intriguing with the English. On the 16th of December we moved to the banks of the Axenes, here called the Chenab. It has received the waters of the Hydaspes and Hydraotes before it reaches this place. We passed the river on the 21st of December, our baggage having taken some days in crossing before us, and we pitched about 3 miles from the right bank of the river. From this ground, we first discerned the mountains of Afghanistan. They appeared at a great distance to the west, and must have been part of the range of Soliman, which is to the northwest of Dera Ghazi Khan, and, consequently, 70 or 80 miles from Multan. At length our preparations were completed, and, after many projects for overcoming the difficulties of a journey through the snow to Kandahar, we had the satisfaction of learning that the king had set out on his road to Kabul. We therefore renewed our march on the 29th of December and began to cross the little desert which extends from north to south upwards of 250 miles, but the breadth of which was so little in this part that we crossed it in 2 marches. It fills up all that part of the country between the Hydaspes and Indus, which is not inundated by these rivers. and extends from the latitude of Uch, where the inundated lands of both join, to the Salt Range. It seems to be a part of the Great Desert cut off from the main body by the rivers and their rich banks. We entered it a few miles west of our encampment near the Assassins. The line between the cultivated country and the desert was marked and decided, and we found ourselves at once among sandhills, stunted bushes, burrs and folk. Yet these were not so common as to preclude the necessity of carrying forage for our cattle. The sandhills were lower than those of the Great Desert, and here they were grey, while those had been reddish-yellow. The water was brackish. At the end of our second march, we were within the limits of the inundation of the Indus, and on the morning of the 31st of December, Mr. Strachey, Lieutenant Macartney and I set out for the banks of that celebrated river. We had a guide on a camel, some troopers, and 3 or 4 servants on camels and horses. We passed over a rich soil covered with long grass, in which were mixed many trees of the kind like willow, and here and there patches of cultivation. The day was cloudy, with occasional drops of rain, and a very cold wind blew till afternoon. The hills were distinctly in sight during the whole of our ride. Their appearance was beautiful. We clearly saw 3 ranges, the last of which was very high, and we often doubted whether we were deceived by the clouds, or really saw still higher ranges beyond. While we were looking at the hills, a mass of heavy clouds rolled down those most to the north, so as entirely to conceal them from our sight, and a line of clouds rested on the middle of those to the west, leaving the summits and the bases clear. On the next day, these clouds had passed away and had left the hills covered with snow. We were anxious and happy as we approached the river, and were not a little gratified when at last we found ourselves upon its banks. The Indus, besides its great name, and the interest it excites as the boundary of India, was rendered a noble object by its own extent, and by the lofty hills which formed the background of the view. We were, however, a little disappointed in its appearance, owing to an island which divided it and impaired the effect of its stream. There were other islands and sandbanks in the river, but near the side where we stood, it came up to the edge and seemed deep and rapid. While on the bank of the river, we met a native, to whose conversation, and that of the guide, we listened with great interest and curiosity. The plains on the opposite shore we found were inhabited by Baloches, and the mountains by the Shironis, a fierce and turbulent tribe. On the other side of the range were tribes and places, of which we had never heard the names, while those we had learned from our maps were equally new to our informants. All we could learn was that beyond the hills was something wild, strange and new, which we might hope one day to explore. From Udu, Dakota, near which we first saw the Indus, to the ferry of Kahiri, where we crossed it, is about 75 miles. It is a narrow tract, contested between the river and the desert. If in hunting we were led many miles to the west of the road, we got into branches of the river and troublesome quicksands, among thickets of tamarisk or of reeds, and, if we went as far to the right, the appearance of sand, and even in some places of sandhills, admonished us of the neighbourhood of the desert. Many parts, however, were cultivated with great pains and method, and produced good crops of wheat, barley, turnips and cotton. The fields were always enclosed, either with hedges of dry thorn, with hurdles of willow, or with fences made of stiff mats of reeds supported by stakes. The houses were often built of the same material. We were struck with the neatness of the farmyards, so unlike those of Hindustan. They were regularly enclosed, had gates of 3 or 4 bars, and contained sheds for the cattle, dunghills, etc. It was also new to us to observe hand barrows and to see oxen fed with turnips. Some of the houses near the river attracted our attention, being raised on platforms, supported by strong posts, 12 or 15 feet high. We were told they were meant to take refuge in during the inundation, when the country for 10 or 12 kos, 20 or 24 miles, from the banks was under water. The people were remarkably civil and well behaved. Their features were more pleasing than those of the people at Bahawalpur and Multan, and their appearance and complexion continued to improve as we got northward till we reached the ferry. Their dress improved in the same manner. Even towards the south, the men were all dressed in gowns of white or blue cotton, and had no part of their bodies exposed, which, with their beards and the gravity and decency of their behaviour, made them look like Mullavis, or doctors of Mohammedan law in Hindustan. Even there, they wore brownish-grey greatcoats of coarse woolen cloth, and that dress became more common towards the north, where all the people wore coloured clothes, blue, red, or check. The turban also is there exchanged for caps of quilted silk, not unlike Welsh wigs, and certainly not handsome. Our halting places were generally at large villages. One was at Leia, which, although it gives its name to the province, is a poor place, containing about 500 houses. At many of these villages are tombs, like those already noticed. The handsomest is that of Muhammad Raujun, at a village that bears his name. It is an octagon building, 3 or 4 stories high and covered with painted tiles. At each corner of the lower story is a small round tower, surmounted by a little minaret which has a good effect. These tombs are conspicuous objects, being generally seen from stage to stage. I ought also to notice a high bank which ran to the right of our road from the march north of Leia to the ferry, though now 7 miles from the Indus. It is said to have been the eastern bank of that river at not very remote period, and its appearance is favourable to the story. At Leia, I was joined by 2 Durrani horsemen. The first I had an opportunity of observing. They were sent by the governor of the province to accompany me to his limits. They both wore large red mantles, lined or edged with fur. One was fair, with a high nose and a pleasing countenance. He wore a silken turban over a small cap. The other was dark, with coarse, blunt features and a hardy look. He wore a sheepskin cap like a Persian, but lower. Both were civil and attentive. At Leia also, I was visited by a Persian attendant of the king's, and by a young Hindu, a brother of Muddard Khan's Divan, who, though dressed like a Durrani, still bore strong traces of his origin. I was a good deal surprised at the freedom with which all my visitors spoke of the government and of the civil wars. Besides those persons whom we met in towns, and the common labouring people, the general desire to see us gave us opportunities of observing almost all descriptions of men. Sometimes a number of horsemen would join us on the line of march, 2 or 3 sallying from every village we passed. They were often on mares, with the foals running after them, and armed with long spears. They were always very civil. The notions entertained of us by the people were not a little extraordinary. They had often no conception of our nation or religion. We have been taken for Syuds, Moguls, Afghans, and even for Hindus. They believed we carried great guns, packed up in trunks, and that we had certain small boxes, so contrived as to explode and kill 6 men each without hurting us. Some thought we could raise the dead, and there was a story current that we had made and animated a wooden ram at Multan, that we had sold him as a ram, and that it was not till the purchaser began to eat him that the material of which he was made was discovered. At the ferry on the Indus, we met some Sikh merchants who had gone as far as Daman to purchase madder. They described the Afghan tribes as generally very kind to travellers and honest in their dealings. But one tribe, the Viziris, they said, were savages and eat human flesh. We crossed the Indus at the Kahari ferry on the 7th of January. The main stream was there 1,010 yards broad, though its breadth was diminished by several parallel branches, one of which was 250 yards broad. We passed in good flat-bottomed boats made of fur and capable of carrying from 30 to 40 tons. Our camels had their feet tied and were thrown into the boats like any other baggage. Our horses also crossed in boats. The elephants alone swam, to the great astonishment of the people of the country, who, probably, had never seen an animal of the kind before. From the ferry to Dera Ismail, Caun was 35 miles. The country was covered with thickets of long grass and thorny shrubs, full of game of all kinds, from partridges to wild boars and leopards. The cultivation was flourishing, but was not extensive, though water is abundant, and the soil, to appearance, enjoys all that richness and fecundity for which inundated countries are so famous. We reached Dera Ismail Khan on the 11th of January. Before we entered Dera, we were met by Futteh Khan, a Balocha who governs this province as deputy for Muhammad Khan, to whom it, as well as Leia, is assigned by the king. He was splendidly attired and accompanied by a few infantry and a troop of ill-dressed and ill-mounted horse armed with long spears. He and his companions expatiated on the greatness of their master, on the strength of his 20 forts, the number of his cannon, the 40 blacksmiths who had employed night and day to make shot for them, and other topics of the same kind. In the course of the day, Futteh Khan sent us a present, including 6 bottles of Kabul wine and 2 of the essence of a plant much vaunted in the East, and called the Bedi Mishk, or musk willow. We remained near a month at Dera Ismail Khan, waiting for a Mehmandawa. The town is situated in a large wood of date trees within 100 yards of the Indus. It has a ruinous wall of unburned bricks, about 1.5 miles in circumference. The inhabitants of the town were chiefly Baloches, though there were also some Afghans and Hindus. The latter have a temple in the town. The country people are Baloches and Juts, resembling those on the opposite bank of the Indus. We saw many Afghans from Daman, who differed much from the Baloches. They were large and bony men with long, coarse hair, loose turbans and sheepskin cloaks, plain and rough but pleasing in their manners. We had often groups of horsemen round our camp who came from a distance to look at us, and visitors who were prompted by curiosity to court our acquaintance. There were several hordes of wandering shepherds encamped in different parts of the vast plain where we went on the day after our arrival to examine one, which belonged to the Korotis, the rudest of all the pastoral tribes. We rode about 10 miles to this camp, over a plain of hard mud, like part of the desert, but covered with bushes of jaunt and kareel, and evidently rich, though neglected. On our way, we saw some Afghan shepherds driving a herd of about 50 camels towards Dera. One of the camels was pure white, with blue eyes. The Afghans spoke no Persian nor Hindustani. They were very civil, stopped the white camel till we had examined it, and showed us their swords, which we were desirous to look at, because the hilts differed from those both of Persia and India. They were most like those of the latter country, but neater. At last, after a ride of 10 miles, we reached the camp. It was pitched in a circle, and the tents were coarse brown blankets, each supported by 2 little poles placed upright, and one laid across for a ridgepole. The walls were made of dry thorn. Our presence excited some surprise, and one man, who appeared to have been in India, addressed me in a kind of Hindustani and asked what brought us there, whether we were not contented with our own possessions, Cawnpore and Lucknow and all those fine places. I said we came as friends and were going to the king. After this we soon got intimate, and by degrees we were surrounded by people from the camp. The number of children was incredible. They were mostly fair and handsome. The girls, I particularly observed, had aquiline noses and Jewish features. The men were generally dark, though some were quite fair. One young man in particular, who stood and stared in silent amazement, had exactly the colour, features and appearance of an Irish haymaker. They had generally high noses, and their stature was rather small than large. Some had brown woolen greatcoats, but most had white cotton clothes, and they all wore white turbans. They were very dirty. They did not seem at all jealous of their women. Men, women and children crowded round us, felt our coats, examined our plated stirrups, opened our holsters, and showed great curiosity, but were not troublesome. Scarce one of them understood any language but Pushtu, but in their manners they were all free, good-humoured and civil. I learnt that they had been there 3 months and were to return in 2 more to pass the summer near Ghuzni. They said that was a far superior country to Daman. I could make out little even of what the linguist said, and there were too many, both of English and Afghans, to admit of any attempt at a regular conversation. Before we left Dera, two of our party, Mr. Fraser and Lieutenant Harris, set out on an expedition of considerable hazard and difficulty. Their object was to ascend the peak called Tukta Soliman, or Solomon's Throne, where the people of the country believe the Ark to have rested after the deluge. After 2 days' march over a naked plain, they came to an ascent, and, 4 miles farther on, to the village of Daroban, the chief place of the little tribe of Mionkail. It is a neat little town on a fine, clear, cold stream, 6 miles from the hills. They were received by the chief's brother, who had just come in from hunting. He was a fair, good-looking young man, with a rude but becoming dress, a bow and quiver at his back, a hare's scut in his turban, and 2 fine greyhounds following him. His reception of the strangers was kind. He ordered dinner to their tent and proposed that his brother should wait on them, but did not press the visit on their excusing themselves. For dinner they had a good pilo and a plate of the fat of the tail of the Dumba sheep to steep their bread in. Next morning, Omar Khan, the chief, came while the gentlemen were dressing. He waited without the tent till they were ready, and then entered. He was an uncommonly handsome fair man, under 30 years of age. He wore a black shawl turban and a light blue cloak, ornamented with black silk frogs at the breast. His manners were very pleasing, and his demeanour dignified and easy. After they became acquainted, he told them that he was in much distress at that time, owing to factions in his tribe, asked their advice, and even begged them to give him a talisman to secure his success. While at Daroband, the 2 gentlemen were riding out with 2 or 3 Hindustani horsemen behind them, when the latter were mobbed, and a stranger of the tribe of Soliman Kyle struck one of them thrice with the flat of a naked sword. The cause could not be discovered, as the Afghans spoke nothing but Pushtu. Omar Khan alone, having been at Kabul, spoke Persian, of which some mullahs also knew a few words. Omar Khan endeavoured to dissuade the gentlemen from their enterprise as being too dangerous. But, finding that vain, he contrived to procure safeguards from his own enemies, the Shiranis, in whose country the mountain lay. He also made the gentlemen cover themselves up, so as to look as like natives of the country as they could, and he advised them to leave all their Indians behind. They then set off into the hills. They found the north side sloping, covered with fir trees, and abounding in rocks of a kind of pudding stone. There were many valleys divided by narrow ridges, and each watered by a clear brook. So circuitous was the road by which they travelled, that after they had advanced about 12 miles, they found they were still 3 days' journey from the top. They also learned that the upper part of the mountain was rendered inaccessible by the snow, and these considerations, with the intended departure of the mission, rendered it necessary for them to return. They slept that night in a Shironi village, lodging in a low hovel, partly sunk in the ground. They were offered bread and meat boiled in small lumps, but so bad that they could not eat it. They were lighted by pieces of a kind of deal, so full of turpentine that they burned like torches. They then returned to Daraban and, after giving presents to the chief and his brother, they set out for camp. They both spoke highly of the kindness of Omar Khan, and were also pleased with the attentions of one of the leaders of the party opposed to him. On their way back, as they approached a ruined village, they saw spears rise, and 7 horsemen issue forth. The gentlemen had but 1 man with them, but fortunately he was the guide furnished by Omar Khan. The party in ambuscade was commanded by that chief's nephew, who, though he probably was as hospitable as the rest while the gentlemen were his guests, thought himself at full liberty to plunder them after they had quitted the lands of his tribe. He was, however, persuaded by the guide to go away without injuring them. Soon after, they were called to by a man on foot and desired to stop. On their disregarding him, the man lay down and, fixing his matchlock on its rest, took a very deliberate aim at Mr. Harris. Here, however, the guide again interposed, and they reached camp without any farther adventures. Some of the people of Doroban afterwards came to our camp and received ample returns of hospitality from the gentlemen who had visited them. Near the end of January, we received intelligence from Muhammad Khan that the king was certainly coming to Peshawar, and that Mullah Jafar Sistani was appointed to attend us till some person of rank could join us. After the passage of several shuppers, or couriers on horseback, from the court, Mullah Jafar joined us, and we began to get ready for our march. Mullah Jafar had been a schoolmaster in his native country of Sistan, but had afterwards come to court to better his fortune. He had some success in commerce, and had an opportunity of obliging the king and enriching himself at once by purchasing some of His Majesty's jewels during his misfortunes and flight to the mountains. He was now in great favour, though he maintained the style and manners of an ordinary merchant. He was a grave old gentleman, shrewd, sensible, and good-humoured, but blunt and somewhat passionate. Under his guidance, we set out from Dera Ismail Khan on the 7th of February. Our road lay through thickets, as above described, on the riverside. When we got near the end of our march, we discovered a party of Persian or Durrani horse drawn up across the way, and soon learned they were 100 horse who had come from the king and brought me a letter. The whole of the troops were dressed like Persians, with coloured clothes, boots, and low sheepskin caps. They had very neat housings of leopard skin and other materials. They wore Persian hilted swords and had generally matchlocks. Some had very short blunderbusses with very small stocks and barrels of exceedingly thin iron tied to their girdles. They had small but light and good horses. They were, on the whole, a very neat and orderly party. After we came to our ground, they sent us 20 mule loads of the fruits of Kabul, apples, grapes, etc. In the evening, I went to a tent pitched about 100 yards from my camp to receive a dress of honour sent me from the king. I found the tent filled with the principal people from the king, standing with the same respect as if His Majesty had been present. I was instructed to bow to the dress and was afterwards invested with a large flowing robe of gold cloth lined with satin, which I was told the king himself had worn. A shawl was wound round my hat, and the king's letter was stuck in it. Another shawl was given to me for a girdle, and all present said a short prayer. The dress was rich, and the shawls costly. Next day, after passing through a country like that of the last day, we came to Sand, and soon after reached the village of Paharpur, which is scarcely less than Dera. We had heavy rain that night, and at daybreak we were struck with the appearance of the mountains of Soliman, which had been concealed for a week or more by thick vapour, and now stood forth in new splendour, the pureness of the air, and the great addition of snow, making them seem higher and nearer than ever. Our march lay over sand, but before the end of it we reached scattered hills. Our camp was pitched near the village of Puniala, in a cheerful and beautiful spot, such as one could figure a scene in Arabia Felix. It was a sandy valley, bounded by craggy hills, watered by a little stream, and interspersed with clumps of date trees and with patches of green corn. The village itself stood in a deep grove of date trees on the side of a hill, from which many streams gushed through little caverns in the thickest part of the wood. The inhabitants were Balochis and Sheikhs of Arabian descent. They plundered some of our people and made others prisoners. And though this was made up and we hired a strong safeguard from them, we still lost some camels and had stragglers plundered after we had left the place. The next 40 miles of our journey were up the valley of Largi, which, though only separated by a ridge of hills from the Indus, was so dry and sandy that we were obliged to carry water as in the desert. Yet even there we saw some camps of shepherds of the Afghan tribe of Murwut, to whom the country belongs. After 2 dreary marches through the valley, we came into a rich and beautiful plain 35 miles in diameter, encircled with mountains and divided by the Indus. We encamped that day on the river Kurum, then shallow, though broad, but in summer a deep and rapid river. From this, we made 3 marches across the plain to Calabar, or Karabakh. The country belonged to the tribe of Issaquahl. It was naturally fertile, highly cultivated, and watered by canals 4 feet broad and as many deep. The people were more swarthy than we expected to see men of their nation, and looked more like Indians than Persians. They were, however, easily distinguished from the former people by their long and thick hair, their beards, the loose folds of their turbans, and a certain independent and manly air that marked them for Afghans. They are notorious robbers and carried off some of our camels and of the king's horses, but their ordinary behaviour was civil and decent. I was surprised at their simplicity and equality. Though they are a wealthy and flourishing tribe, their chief, who accompanied me through the whole of their lands, was as plain in his dress and as simple in his manners as the most ordinary person in the tribe.